Welcome back to the HG Rugby podcast. Now, usually on this show, we concern ourselves with the obscure in rugby union. We talk about emerging rugby cultures all over the world, or we dive into the minutiae of rugby stats and analytics with elite level coaches and fantastic journalists all over the globe. But this week, we are tackling the elephant in the room. We are taking the bull by the horns, and we are talking about the sports governance itself, how rugby is run, how rugby is structured, and maybe even we'll talk about some of the mistakes that the sport is making as a whole. Joining me to have this fascinating conversation today, I'm delighted to be speaking to Nicks Johnston. Good evening, Nicks. Thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
It's absolutely a pleasure to have you on. Now, very quickly, for the people who don't follow you on Blue Sky or haven't seen you interviewed in the press or on other podcasts before, could you just quickly introduce yourselves for us, and what your kind of expertise, what makes you a world expert on rugby governance?
That's very kind. So my background is that I have a master's in sports law and practice, and I wrote my dissertation on governance and discipline in rugby union, and am obsessed, I think it would be fair to say, with how sports governance has evolved, especially with regard to rugby. And being completely transparent, I am also on the board of Progressive Rugby, the lobby group. We're trying to make rugby safer with regard to head injuries. So you will probably hear me mention that if I get the opportunity.
Yes, and if we have the opportunity, a little bit of spare time, we will get into that. So, I guess starting off with the basics, the beginner's question: what is sports governance? Are we talking about making the laws that we see on the pitch, knock-ons and so on? Are we talking about the structure of competitions? What does sports governance in terms of rugby union actually mean?
Well, the broad view is that it is all of that. So, I mean, if we're going to absolute basics, World Rugby is the global governing body for rugby union, and it is responsible for the laws that you see on the pitch, and it has the ultimate responsibility for the competitions. However, it delegates a lot of things to the underlying unions, so the Welsh Rugby Union, Scottish Rugby Union, New Zealand Rugby Union, and it delegates to the competitions, so the Six Nations, Super Rugby, all of that kind of thing. That's why you see the law variations that they have sometimes in the Southern Hemisphere, because they'll decide that they want to do that. They get sign off from World Rugby, and they will trial it. It's why each of the competitions runs its own disciplinary process. So, if somebody gets sent off in a Six Nations game, it's the Six Nations who deal with that. It's not World Rugby. And then each of the unions, so I mean, my specialist subject would be Scottish Rugby Union being based up here. They're responsible for growing the game in Scotland, for the grassroots level, for how all of that is managed, as well as for the professional side of the game. They have an ownership, a stake in, well, for Scottish Rugby Union, they have a stake in the Six Nations Rugby, they have a stake in the British and Irish Lions, and they have a stake in the URC. They also have a stake in Europe.
Yes, yes. Then we'll talk more about who owns stakes in what a bit later in the podcast. So, uh, let's get into talking about the governance of rugby union then. So, it is governing rugby union inherently different to governing other sports in any way?
So the comparison that's often drawn is with football. And I mean, I remember a few years ago, Courtney Laws saying that professional rugby players should be paid a similar salary to professional footballers. The huge difference is the amount of money in the game. There is nowhere near the amount of money in rugby union that there is in football. I mean, football, I think you have to look at that as being an anomaly because it is so different. Um, Rugby is in the privileged position that it does have an income, but if we're being honest, it's on a knife edge. I mean, I think it was Exeter in the last couple of days have released their results.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, 10.5 million loss. That's, I mean, I don't think there is any club at the moment in the Premiership that's actually making a profit, which is not surprising. Um, so you have all of that. It also has to manage the professional and the amateur sides of the game which, if we're being honest, I mean, the laws are slightly different between the two, especially when it comes to things like head injuries. You have the HIA protocol at professional level. You don't have that at amateur level. You have a 3-week stand down period. Um, Other sports will be perhaps more focused on the amateur side. They won't have as much income, but I don't think it's inherently that different or that difficult compared to other sports. It's a contact sport that makes it trickier. It's a team sport that brings different angles to an individual sport. But I mean, every sport is going to have its own obstacles and its own pros and cons.
With rugby and talking about pros and cons, you mentioned there the the splits between looking at professional versus amateur, and this is something that we're going to talk maybe a bit more when we talk about the WRU later in the show. Rugby is, we still talk about it as being young as a professional sport. It turns professional in 1999, which is 30 years ago now, so we can talk about whether that's still young or not. But that meant that it had a long time in the kind of amateur kind of setup where these amateur clubs and local chair people, board members of local clubs, committees, you could almost call them, uh, became quite entrenched in how that runs the game. And just coming from a Welsh fan's point of view, that's something that gets spoken about a lot. Is that something that maybe in some ways holds rugby back a little bit? Is its entrenchment and its roots in an amateur era, and then it tried to professionalize, the amateurs tried to professionalize themselves almost.
I think that's a really good point because I think when we talk about rugby union as being young in terms of professionalism, a better word perhaps might be immature. Um, I mean, it was essentially, the people who ran rugby union, they didn't particularly want to go professional in 95. They were, held over a barrel kind of thing. There was a gun to their head. And especially, I mean, you look at how it's developed in England, with the Premiership clubs and the relationship between them and the RFU, the independence, the money that goes in there. And I mean, that developed because the RFU weren't quick enough off the mark when rugby went professional. And it's caused all sorts of issues going forward. Is it held back? I don't know is the simple answer. I mean, one view is that rugby lost something when it went professional, and that it lost something with these clubs. I mean, certainly up here, you've got the clubs and the borders, and they're not professional. There's not even a professional side in the borders anymore. And did rugby lose something by not holding on to the club legacy? Or, yeah, as you said, is it being held back by that? Or should it almost be two separate sports, the professional and then staying at the amateur side, people going and watching their local club on a Saturday afternoon and really enjoying it?
Mm. I think that's a really great point. And we referenced the English game there, which is a very, it makes my segue look very professional. I'm going to bring up a couple of images just as window dressing for our YouTube viewers. So we've had kind of the news break today on the day of recording. Well, not necessarily news break, but further developments in this ongoing story about the English rugby clubs going to this franchise model and ring fencing the English Premiership. The one of the main selling points of the English Premiership is supposedly promotion relegation, whereas we all know in reality that hasn't been the case for several years at this point. And now they're talking about going to this, in this article, they refer to it as an IPL style model, and basically looking to expand in the future in a kind more American way in terms of inviting people in and getting them to buy in and growing the franchise that kind of way. Firstly, why do you think that the Premiership is exploring that model?
I think that they've seen what's happened with the IPL, what's happening with cricket in England. They've seen the amount of money that's coming in. And honestly, I think it would almost be a dereliction of duty if they didn't explore it. and see if there was any appetite for it. I would be amazed if there's an appetite for it, though. I mean, you've got Red Bull coming into Newcastle and pumping some money in. I'm very curious to see how long it takes Tony Rowe to find somebody to take over Exeter.
That's a big story, isn't it?
I mean, it's a huge story, and it's interesting because there are, I mean, at the end of the day, you and I both love rugby union, but we're also not naive enough to think that everybody does. There is a limited market, and then there is a very tiny market of people who have got enough interest and enough money to actually do this.
Well, this is with the Newcastle thing that you reference. It's it's both, to me, in my own personal opinion, it's both remarkable and not remarkable that that happened. It's remarkable that a big company like Red Bull would see rugby as an opportunity in the way that it is, and particularly like a team like Newcastle, which is so far away from traditional rugby country down in the southwest of England, and it's the what is the ceiling for what they can achieve, even if they won the Champions Cup, how much promotion could they get out of that? But then at the same time, I'm kind of not surprised that it happened because the amount of money that it would cost them to be successful in rugby union compared to how much they're spending on Formula One and other things is like loose change to a company like Red Bull. But we're talking, sorry, you look like you wanted to chip in there.
Well, I was going to say, I'm wondering if they're doing it as a tax write-off. I mean, I'd love to know what the thought process was behind it. And I think it's fantastic. But because you've got the salary cap and the Premiership, they know that there is only so much money they can throw at this. And I mean, it's going to be really interesting to see how it all pans out. And if I have my very cynical hat on, I wouldn't be surprised if we see another Saracens salary cap issue, but with Newcastle.
I can tell you they've gone absolutely crazy with signings, absolutely crazy
Yeah,
with
I mean,
signings.
it's insane.
It,
And yeah, and a part of me does think, what exactly are you offering here to get people to go up there?
I think I know what they're offering, but
I think we both do.
so let's talk about, you mentioned Tony Rowe and Exeter there, and I think that this is a absolutely fascinating story in that if we just recap and people can find, I'll just bring the camera to myself for a second. People can find a video about Exeter on this channel talking about from last season how this was a team that won the Premiership, that won the Champions Cup, and then pretty much collapsed to the very bottom of the Premiership. You know, they can't get relegated anymore, as we discussed, but they all their big stars left. They tried to exist with kind of academy level talent, and then that didn't work. They were a dreadful rugby team, let's call it what it is. And then they spent a load of money on getting international signings like Stephen Varney, Len Ikitau through the door this season, and the results have vastly improved. But then we've had the story this week that they have announced a loss of £10 million in 1 year. Now, we know that we're used to seeing rugby clubs post losses, 1, 2 million here. We've even become slightly desensitized to £5 million losses, but £10 million loss in 1 year. And Sale Sharks also announced £8 million the week before losses. Is it just when you see these loss figures come in, these headlines about rugby, club rugby specifically losing money, what does it make you think?
Well, it makes me worry about the future of the sport, if we're being quite honest. And what I think is quite terrifying about about Exeter in particular, is that their loss last year was six figures, not eight. And the turnover hasn't, and this is with my financial services hat on, the turnover hasn't gone down a huge amount, but they have paid off a loan, and paid something off to Tony Rowe. And I suspect it's not manipulating the figures, but I suspect it is getting their house in order, pre trying to sell it. So they're massaging the figures isn't fair either. But they're, stuff that has been sort of carried over and carried over and carried over has now been paid off. But I mean, the Sale Sharks one is interesting because I mean, £8 million, how a loss of £8 million, how is a business still sustainable at that point? And and they're still signing players, they're still keeping going. And with especially with the financial regulation that's been going on through the RFU, and they're making sure that all of the clubs are viable after losing Worcester and Wasps and London Irish. I mean, it makes me wonder what the parameters are for being viable.
Yeah.
I certainly, it's a weird one, and I appreciate that I'm talking in circles here. I wouldn't necessarily expect to see clubs breaking even because I don't think rugby union has a sufficient following in the UK for that, certainly not in England. I certainly wouldn't expect them to see them posting losses of that size. And it brings into question things like the salary cap, should that be reduced? Should squad size be reduced, which then has an impact on player welfare? Should the calendar be reduced? Are they just actually playing too many games and therefore they need larger squads, they need more physios, they need more coaches, all of this kind of thing. And I think, I mean, if I was working for one of these clubs, I wouldn't exactly be confident about the future. I mean, I don't know how you cut the costs because, if you want to win, you have to have the good players. Therefore, you have to pay the salaries and you need the backroom staff and you need the commercial staff and all of that to actually run the operation. So, how are you cutting your cloth to fit the budget? Because at the moment, it's just not working.
Well, it's something that you've mentioned there, and this is something that I've discussed on a couple of podcasts and in a couple of articles as well, is the number of games. And in order to generate more money, would it not be more sensible to have more games? So, for example, in the URC, that's now an 18 game season. If I talk about it from a Welsh region point of view, that's down from 22 when it was the Pro 12 era. It's 22 games a season. There is less European Heineken Cup games than there used to be, and there used to be an Anglo-Welsh Development Cup tournament as well. So the number of games is already significantly reduced. Is it not an argument to say that if we want to generate more money for the game, we need more matches so we have bigger TV deals and more tickets sold?
Yeah, I think it's the catch 22, isn't it? That you want more income, therefore, the quick fix is more games because you would hope for more TV revenue, you would hope for more ticket sales, all of that. Doesn't necessarily translate because the games do have to be quality, but you also then need a larger playing squad. So it's a really tricky one. I mean, you look at somebody like Finn Russell, who played, I think, 36 games last season for Bath and for Scotland and for the Lions. And that's too many to be sustainable. And he's incredibly lucky that he got through all of that with no injuries or limited injuries. There was the concussion. Um, but it's too many games. And the other thing, I mean, when we're saying more games, there isn't necessarily squad rotation because certainly fair weather fans, and I would slightly include myself in this because if you watch rugby in January in Scotland, you're only going to go if it's going to be a decent game. Um, they want to see the big names. And a lot of the time, the big names aren't the ones who are playing. And it comes back, I think, possibly to what we were talking about earlier about club rugby and possibly amateur and professional being almost separate and the club game rebuilding its support base. And you go and you watch the really good club players week in, week out, and it's fun. And they might be semi-pro, but they're not going to be taking the same amount of money as somebody like Finn, who I believe is on the best part of £1 million a year.
That's almost like a cricket style model, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's one of those things. I'm not fixed in my views on this, but I think it does need to be properly explored by the powers that be, both the URC at Premiership level, possibly even at World Rugby level, and just go, the model that we have at the moment isn't functioning as well as it could. So what can we do to make it function better? And that is one of the essences of sports governance. How can we promote the game? How can we protect the game? Because I mean,
Mm.
at the end of the day, I mean, if Welsh rugby genuinely goes down to three regions, that I think is going to be more devastating to rugby than losing Wasps, Worcester, and London Irish from the Premiership.
Oof, that's a good headline. And we will talk about the WRU and the three regions planned in a second. But I just want to quickly circle back. You talked about if we play more games, we'll need bigger squads, and that's more money.
Mm.
And the root cause, is it not that the root causes of that is player wages? And my question then is this a mistake that rugby has made and the horses kind of bolted in terms of player salaries, went to a level that the sport wasn't ready for and now can't go back?
I think you're absolutely right. I think the salary bills, the wage bill, it's unsustainable. Um, I mean, you look, we're going back to the Exeter loss and the Sale Sharks loss. I mean, the first thing you would do is cut the salaries. That would just make sense. But while you have got quite an inflated salary cap and the exceptions to the salary cap, there's always going to be somebody who will pick up a player. And I mean, they'll all end up at Newcastle. Um, but and you want to keep winning the games. So, I mean, we perhaps, the emphasis is on star players and their wages, and some of them deliver and some of them don't. But I think there's got to be more emphasis on the team environment and the coaching staff because they are the people who actually get the best out of the players and create the environment that the players and the team can thrive in. Because, I mean, you can do, what was it? Was it LA Galaxy? Somebody like that. And they had all of these star players, but actually getting them to communicate on the pitch, well, too long for a long time.
Yeah.
They had incredible players and they did really well. And then a couple of them went, they brought in a couple of other big names and it was a disaster.
Yeah, it's I could talk for ages about, especially in Wales, about how we worry way too much about players' wages and not actually who's up in the coaching box. But anyway, that's something for a different podcast. But before we go any further, and in the next section, we are going to talk about the WRU specifically in depth. And Nicks, I know that's a story you've been following very closely, so I'm very excited for that chat. But before we go any further, I just want to remind people if you are enjoying the podcast so far, then please consider subscribing to this YouTube channel. I have recently passed 10,000 subscribers, but I'm greedy for more. And as you can see, it's a hugely diverse number of topics here on this YouTube channel. We never talk about the same thing 2 weeks in a row. And if you'd like to get into the more obscure, more nerdy side of rugby union, that is something that I would love for you to be involved in. Or if you are listening on audio versions, whether that's Apple or Spotify, please consider subscribing and following there. On Spotify, you can leave a comment now, and it is my target to get to 400 followers on Spotify, well behind the YouTube. So that's my next target. Please help me get there. Much appreciated. Okay, then, Nicks, let's get into it. The really juicy one, the Welsh Rugby Union. This is the thing that's making my life miserable on a day-to-day basis at the moment, and certainly making rugby not fun anymore. So, as you've referred to before, going down from 4 to 3, I think, first of all, what made you say that going from 4 to 3 Welsh regions would be more devastating than losing any English rugby club?
I think the way that it's been done, that it's come from the governing body, and I think as well because of the history of rugby in Wales. But I think because it's come from the governing body, it's a deliberate action. And while we look at Wasps and Worcester and London Irish, they actually went broke. They went bankrupt. Um, and it couldn't have, well, it probably could have been foreseen by some people, but it was it was sad, but it wasn't premeditated. This is premeditated, and it just doesn't sit hugely well with me. It may be the right thing for Welsh rugby. I'm not saying that it's not. What I am saying is that I really don't like the way that the situation has been handled. It feels
Yeah,
it feels quite disingenuous.
that is definitely a word that I would use. And if we look back at, I know that you went and read all of those PDFs and PowerPoint presentations and things that were put out. So you're someone who's looked at kind of paperwork a lot,
Mm.
to give it a catch-all term. You've gone through these kind of things. You've sat in these presentations. You've read these dossiers. What have you made of the standard of what has been fed to the Welsh public so far?
So this is my personal opinion. Um, I think it's been amateurish. I think certainly the impression I've had is that they brought in the consultancy Portus. They brought them in with an agenda, which was to cost cut. Um, it smacks of desperation. They need to cost cut. But it hasn't, at no point has it been well thought out. Portus is, because I did a bit of a deep dive on them, they're
Yeah, this is
primarily
something that you talk about a lot. I'm sorry to interrupt. This is something
yeah,
that I see you talk a lot more about than other people, is this consultancy that the WRU went through.
yeah. I mean, firstly, I've got two questions for the WRU. Are Portus still involved and how much are you paying them? Because frankly, whatever you're paying them is far too much. Um, Portus are based in the Middle East. They talk about their expertise in sport, and they do have expertise in the commercial side of sports. So well, expertise in inverted commas. They have got very, very limited knowledge and expertise in the governance side. And I think they were trying to make a name for themselves. I'm not quite sure. They might want to disassociate themselves from this now. But certainly one of the presentations I saw, if somebody who worked for me had produced that, I would have handed it back and said, you want to start again? It was amateurish. It was littered with mistakes. The figures in graphs didn't match up. They didn't have the right caveats to it. They'd manipulated stuff. They were hoping that people didn't actually look it up. And they were talking about the number of professional rugby players in Wales compared to other places. Didn't take into account that clubs like Ealing are professional. And they were like, oh, well, we meant the top tier. And it's like, well, that's not what you said. Um, it was, I genuinely wondered if the wrong presentation had left the building. And I just, there was a similar consultation in Scotland 3 years ago, which was done by people who are close to Scottish rugby, who weren't paid to do it, or they were paid a stipend. I mean, it really was not a lot of money, and it was very well done. And it's resulted in Scottish rugby being restructured. It is a very functional structure now. You've got Scottish rugby, so you've got Scottish Rugby Union, which is the overarching governing body. The people who run that are not paid.
Wow.
The president is paid a little bit because the president gives up a lot of time. They're effectively the oversight committee. You've got Scottish Rugby Limited, which runs the commercial side. So Murrayfield, the pro teams, they are paid. They should be. They do a very good job. And then you've got the Club Rugby Board, which runs the amateur side of the game. And again, that's volunteers. Really good communication channels. It's taken time to bed in. It's quite a different model. Apparently, it's based on German car manufacturers. Um,
Right.
it's quite different, but it's really functional and it works. Porters could have spoken to Scottish Rugby. No, I mean they're not actually. Their solution isn't really changing anything. It's just cutting two teams, or that was their preferred solution. Now they've come up with, or the Welsh Rugby Union have come up with cutting one team, which is also going to cut revenue. There was no feasibility study done, so they don't know what the URC's reaction was going to be. They don't know what Europe's reaction is going to be. They don't know if they're going to be penalties for breaking a contract. And this whole allowing players to go and sign for Gloucester and whoever else they're signing. And with my very, very cynical hat on, part of me is going, are they going to say at the end of this season, we do not have enough professional players in Wales to operate four teams? Therefore, that gets us out of any URC penalties. That's not how a contract works.
Mm.
But I don't think it is actually a long-term solution. It might be a long-term solution, actually. That's not fair. I don't think it's been thought out properly. And the fact that no feasibility study was done before that, I don't even know how to describe the questionnaire that went out. I mean, that's something that I would expect a school kid to produce, and that's being a little bit
Completely
derogatory to
agree.
school kids. I mean, don't you can't asking people asking fans about income and do you want to see the team win? Of course you want to see the team win.
It was questions like, do you agree that the team is doing badly? So would you therefore agree that significant change is needed? It's like, well, hang on a
Yeah.
second.
It was structured in a way, it was very leading. That's what
Yes,
I'm trying
very
to
leading.
say. And I think that they had come up with the answer that they wanted to get to, which was to cut two teams. And then, of course, all hell breaks loose, as it rightly does. And there, I saw another questionnaire. I think it was Glad Rugby.
Yes.
That was streaks ahead. But I think what annoys me about the Portis thing is that this will be costing the Welsh Rugby Union a lot of money that they don't have. And there is so much rugby intellect in Wales that they could have tapped into that. And they didn't. And it's just and there's so much sports intellect in Wales. I mean, you look at well, I mean, Glamorgan and the IPL and the deal they've done. Speak to the people who are running Glamorgan. Um, you know, just get out there and talk to people. And the fact that Dave Rudden didn't start going around the clubs until he was basically forced to is not good. They should have been out there talking to them right away, going, look, we've got an issue. What do you, or just going out there and going, what do you think about the state of Welsh rugby and actually listening?
Who's overseeing the rugby governance? Who are they answerable to? If they do a bad job, if they lead the sport into rack and ruin, which is the opinion of some, certainly Welsh rugby fans, I'm sure there are some rugby fans all over the world who have gripes and complaints to do with rugby governance. Who steps in? Who sacks these people? Who tells them to do a better job? I mean, like for instance, the WRU are to appear in front of the British government um, imminently, I believe. Is that who they answer to? Can the government step in, or is it a
Um,
private business and no one can do anything about it?
no, it's owned by the clubs. So all of the clubs who get invited to the AGM, that's who owns rugby union in Wales. The Welsh Rugby Union may have a slightly different view on that. Their view is wrong. It's owned by the clubs. I mean, this MPs to question WRU bosses. I don't imagine that's going to be a comfortable conversation, but there is a limited amount that the government can do. Two of the questions I would like them to, the government or the MPs at the select committee, two of the questions I would like them to ask is that the WRU demonstrates compliance with the Sport Wales framework and with the UK Code of Sporting Governance. If they cannot demonstrate compliance, that would mean that the WRU and all of the underlying clubs are not eligible for any form of government funding, including national lottery money.
Wow. Okay.
It's a big one. Um, I think it's one of those ones that I'd ask the question because I'd like to see the look on their faces and
Well,
the
let's see
whole.
if they've ever heard of it, you mean?
Well, I was trying to be tactful, but yes, because it's an argument we had in Scotland and that I had with somebody up here, and they said, but it doesn't apply to us. And I was like, well, you get lottery funding, clubs get lottery funding, it applies to you, and it's just good practice, and it's not. I mean, to be fair, the UK Code of Sporting Governance is not onerous. A lot of it is to do with transparency and communication.
Hmm.
You would do it for a business anyway. Um, Same with the Sport Wales framework. I mean, there's, I mean, they can have it's appearing in front of a select committee. They could have an uncomfortable conversation, but there is a limited amount that can actually happen. Unless, I mean, realistically, they're not going to cut their funding if they can't demonstrate compliance. They'll send them away and tell them to sort their shit out and give them 6 months or something to do it.
Hmm.
And they'll probably go back to Portis and spend another six figures on drivel. Um, or they could bring me in because I'm a lot cheaper and I'm a lot nicer to work with.
Ah, yes.
That's my plug for my business.
Links in the description below.
Yes, very much. Please do contact me. Um, but I mean, if Welsh Rugby Union went broke, they're a member union of World Rugby. World Rugby have stepped in before for what we call tier two nations when they've had financial issues, when they've had governance
Well,
issues.
check the world rankings. We're not far off.
Yeah. Um, whether or not World Rugby would step in, I think, I suspect CVC or the Six Nations would step in first, or the URC, because
Mm.
they can't actually afford Welsh rugby to go broke. And I think if it got to that point, and I'm not saying or suggesting that it will, I think we might actually see CVC bare their teeth. Their current chief exec, who is very, very well regarded, is a big rugby fan. And he will, well, I don't suppose he's actually probably got the time to get involved in the minutiae of this, but they have set up a sports arm. They're putting all of their sporting investments in this. They are bringing in quite a lot of expertise to look at it and to maximize the commercial revenue. And if they think that their investment is under threat, they will act.
I could do a whole podcast about the CVC deal. I've written about it, I've researched it, and I haven't heard anybody. That's not true. I was about to say I've never heard anyone talk about it in a positive light. I've heard because of the timing of it, just happened to be just before COVID and the lockdown, and obviously all games were cancelled. People talking about the injection of money just kept the lights on, basically.
Yeah.
But I don't think anyone's expectations of what that deal would lead to has been met, whether that's on the rugby side or on CVC side. To ask the question in a provocative way, who was the fool there? Who didn't do their due diligence? Who didn't realize what they were really signing up to?
So I was, when the deals were going through, I was very vocal on social media about it because financial services is my background and I actually understand private equity and venture capitalism. Well, understand as much as anybody does. Um, and I got told by a couple of people quite high up in various unions that I didn't know what I was talking about, which is a little bit of a red rag to a bull.
I hate that as well. I hate being told that I'm wrong when I'm not. I can't stand it.
Well, and I hate not being listened to. And if somebody listens to me and goes, I disagree with you, that's absolutely fine. I don't have an issue with that.
Yes.
Um, but being spoken to as though I was a toddler having a tantrum did not go down well. Um, I think even pre-COVID, the finances of the various unions were precarious. And I think that they saw CVC as being the golden goose. They did not read the, did not properly understand the documentation or the deal that was put in front of them. They didn't listen to explanations from lawyers because lawyers will have explained it. They didn't listen to people like me going, this does not mean that CVC is invested for 5 years. It means that your payment term is 5 years. CVC will still own 28%, I think it is, of the Six
It's a
Nations, for example.
crazy. It's selling the TV revenue for the Six Nations was a mental decision, in my opinion. Not that
And
I'm an expert in any way.
I can see from a commercial point of view, I think the CVC investment has been quite disappointing because I think CVC could have brought a lot more to the table than they have done. But I appreciate that COVID got in the way of that. And I had quite high hopes of CVC, for want of a better expression, knocking people's heads together and getting them to all work together. That hasn't really happened. Um, but I think rugby need, whether CVC or private equity investment was the right thing to take rugby to the next level, I don't know. But I think rugby needed that shove. And it's got the injection of cash, but it hasn't had the shove. But I mean, I don't think anybody was malicious in signing the deal, but I think there was an enormous amount of naivety.
Hmm.
And they didn't think, I think they assumed that the commercial revenues would increase to such an extent that they wouldn't notice the bit that was being siphoned off to CVC. And of course, that hasn't happened because COVID, no games, cost of living crisis, all this kind of stuff. So I think from that perspective, it hasn't panned out, I wouldn't have said, the way anybody thought it would. The other part that concerned me a lot when the deals were signed was that CVC can now, it's over 5 years, isn't it?
Hmm.
CVC could now sell their stake and they can sell it to anybody. And my understanding is that there is not a veto in place. So what I would expect to see in a contract like this is that it gets the CVC decide to sell their stake, it gets offered to the Six Nations or the URC or whoever it is first. They get first refusal on it at probably a defined price, which would be, it'll be a percentage increase or something like that. And then if they decline, they can sit at the table when the negotiations are going on with other potential bidders or buyers. My understanding is that that's not actually in the contracts. So CVC could suddenly go, well, actually, do you know what? We're going to sell to Red Bull or we're going to sell to Louis Vuitton and say,
Elon Musk.
God forbid. Although that might actually solve some problems. Um, and suddenly you're left having to work with these people.
Mm.
And I mean, I don't that is conjecture on my part. It's what I've been told. I haven't seen the documentation or the contract, so I don't know that for sure. But it just, if that is the case, that would have been hugely naive on the part of the competitions. And I would be concerned about the legal advice they got because that's certainly, and I'm not a lawyer, but that is something that as a risk and compliance specialist, I would have told a client that they had to have those clauses included before signing the deal.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, I did not know that. That's fascinating. Okay, we're going to have another little advert break here, but before we do, I just want to remind people that if you are really enjoying the podcast and if you've gotten this far in, I suggest that you are enjoying it, or at least hating it enough to the you're willing to pay money to hate on it, is that you can get membership for my YouTube channel. And that looks like this. For just 99 pence a month, depending on your region, price may vary, you will get access to weekly bonus videos. I'm coming up to 40 of those now. I've just released one today at time of recording, which is the outtakes from my trip to Cardiff. See, I'm just looking at a picture of my sad face here. My trip to Cardiff to see my Wales team get absolutely destroyed 73-0 by the Springboks. There's outtakes and behind the scenes from my trip to Bordeaux. And there's even videos that I worked very hard on, but I was worried we're going to get a copyright strike, so I've made members only. So if you'd like a piece of that, you can hit the join button that's somewhere down here and get access, and it supports the channel. That helps me make more and better content. Thank you in advance. All right, Nick, so let's have the fun one now, the one where we really just get to stick the boot in. Let's talk about R360. So you and I are both very aligned on our views of R360 as being a crazy thing, and we'll talk about from your professional point of view, the alarm bells from kind of the side that the person on the street wouldn't normally see. But my first question is, what about rugby has created the opportunity for a venture like R360 to even be thought of?
I'm not actually sure the opportunity exists. I think it's some people who think that there's possibly some money to be made out of it by, well, I think it's Saudi Arabia trying to sports wash, if we're being completely honest. And they managed to get Mike Tyndall involved because they thought he'd be a good face to front it. Um, I don't think that the opportunity is there. I mean, the whole idea is bonkers. It's a bit like the Harlem Globetrotters, but rugby union. And
Yeah,
I mean, the fact that it managed, I mean, the one thing it did achieve, it managed, apart from the Welsh Rugby Union, it managed to unite all of the tier one unions to say, if you go and play for them, you can't play for us. Which, I mean, World Rugby must have been sitting there going, God, is this all we had to do to get them on the same page? Um, it's
they also apparently robbed Louis Rees-Zammit of a few $100,000 a year, apparently, because apparently he signed a short-term contract with Bristol, thinking he was going to
mm,
hop to R360 in a year and get paid mega bucks, and it's not happened, and now he's had to sign a much reduced terms at Bristol.
yeah, I mean, this really annoyed me when they were coming out in the press and saying that they'd signed these players. It's like you haven't signed them because you haven't got anything to sign them to. You might have signed a heads of contract, and that when you get up and running, or if you get up and running, um, you'll give them a contract. But it was like you don't have authorization from World Rugby. You haven't sorted any of your shit out, and you're promising these players huge amounts, I mean, life-changing amounts of money, and yet you've got no revenue stream, and we don't know where any of it's coming from. And there's something that just, it doesn't sit right with me on that one, because
Yeah.
you do get that Lewis v. Samet situation. And it's like, no, that's leading people on. It's being, I like this word today, it's being disingenuous.
Yes. So just on that, and this was a question that I did have down to ask you, it was how does employment law and sport gel? Because surely there's things about employment law. I know you said earlier that you're not an employment law expert or an
Mm,
HR expert, but th th there's things like, for example, the 25 cap rule in Wales is something that's held up as an example of this. Of
mm.
it's a restriction of trade and things like that, and it's artificially limiting people's opportunities and things. But just, more than just that example, does employment law and being a professional athlete work?
Um, so my understanding, and this is very much, it's a limited understanding, um, because sports teams select players, so whether that is Ospreys, whether it's Edinburgh, whether it's Wales, they are allowed, in inverted commas, to put restrictions on that. So, you've got to be based in Wales, or you've got to have 25 caps, or I mean, whatever other criteria you can think of, provided it's related to the role that that player would be performing. So, as a professional rugby player, you have to have 25 caps for your country to play outside of Wales, or I think it's that you haven't been offered a professional contract in Wales, so therefore you can go and play outside of Wales. Um, there's a lot of very grey areas in it, I will say that, and it's not something that I'm really that comfortable talking about because it's so grey. And there are, as you said, I mean, there are conflicts. I mean, you get into, well, if Wales goes from 4 regions to 3, and they start trying to move players who are on contracts with the region that is closed to other regions, are they allowed to do that, or are they making them redundant? I mean, that's, well, I talked about feasibility study before. That's something that I don't think they've considered. And players may not want to move. They've got families, they've got kids, they've got schools to think about, they've got all of this kind of thing. So it's a complicated area.
Yeah. It makes me feel sorry for the athletes themselves because let's face
Mm.
these are sometimes like 18-year-old kids who they don't know. Let's be honest, these rugby players, some of them are very highly educated, as we know. Some of them, put all their eggs in the rugby basket and maybe they don't know that much about the outside world. So it must be terrifying for them. But going back to R360, so come on then, from a professional's point of view, all the stories about, when they put out statements like we submitted 100 pages to World Rugby and things, what does it make you think when you just see when you're assessing them as a professional organization?
I think I put something really cheeky on social media about that and pretty much went, well done, do you want a medal? I mean, if you're actually putting a proposal together like that, I would expect substantially more documentation than 100 pages. Um, the whole thing, I don't even know how to describe it because it's so baffling. They haven't got stadiums sorted out, they haven't got teams sorted out, they weren't being transparent about their backers, which concerns me because it's like, well, where exactly is this money coming from? I read somewhere they had 1.5 million to spend on the executive team who was setting it up. So that's Tyndall and Stuart Hooper, and there's a sports agent as well. And I'm like, well, that's quite a lot of money to spend on 3 people's salaries for something which may not get out of the starting gate. Um, I think, I mean, while the sports agent, I mean, they've obviously, between the 3 of them, there is a lot of rugby knowledge there. They don't have governance knowledge. I don't think they know how this all works. The fact that they genuinely thought that World Rugby, having sent them away in October and said, pretty much gone, write us a proper plan. Um, the fact that they genuinely thought that they could go to the World Rugby meeting in June, get it signed off, and then start next season. I'm like, do you have any idea of the logistics involved in staging matches of this size? You know, with with the number of spectators and the state. And it was like, but you can't sign anything until you've got sign off from World Rugby. So you're not going to have anything lined up. And quite honestly, I mean, they're saying what, 2028? It's all gone very quiet now. Um, I think it's all going to fall apart. I don't see it happening. I mean, I know Martin Gilbert's the chair of R360.
Mm.
So he used to run Aberdeen Asset Management. He's got a fund management company at the moment. Can't remember the name of it. He's very nice. He's very experienced. He does not suffer fools gladly, and I suspect his patience is rapidly running out. Um, and I'd pay to be a fly on the wall to see when that happens because really will be quite amusing. Having worked for him, and he's a nice man. He likes his rugby, but he's not going to be having any truck with this. But it's just, I mean, we were talking earlier about the consultants for the Welsh Rugby Union used and how amateurish their output was. I don't think the stuff that R360 produced has even reached that level. And
Mm.
obviously, I haven't seen the documentation that was sent to World Rugby. But if you're having to boast about something being 100 pages, I think you've got your priorities a bit wrong. It's just not, it's not well thought out. And I can see the attraction of it that the high level players would play fewer games, but the fact that it's going to be like the Sevens circuit and you're moving location for every match, and you're not then building a supporter base because nobody is going to have the time or the resources to follow it round the globe. So you're looking for local support. And then the ticket prices they were talking about and how it was all going to work. And the maths just didn't add up. It was like, so you're going to play, I think it was 6 or 8 games over a weekend in one stadium. And it's like, well, what are you going to do? You're going to sell tickets for each game and boot people out at the end of that game. And it was like, how's that going to work? It just, yeah, half baked, I think, is being
Yeah,
kind about it.
it very much smacked of three blokes sat at the bar going, "I know what we'll do," and scribbling things down on the back of a bar mat. And I think so.
Or I know what we'll do. I know how we can make a quick buck.
Well, yeah, I mean, or maybe they were reached out by someone in the Middle East and said, "Can you come up with an idea of this?" And they went, "Oh, yeah, sure." And
I
then,
think that is probably what happened. But I mean, the fact that I think it was TNT, their head of broadcast or head of sport, was just like, "Are you having a laugh?" And
yeah,
the fact
yeah.
that they were so upfront about how ridiculous the proposal they'd been sent was, yeah, that says it all. If you can't get the TV on side and you can't get them excited about it and to buy into it, you've got a problem.
100%, 100%. Something that R360 said that they would include, but for me was like the most like, have you even watched this? Of all of the proposals was about women's rugby. And this is kind of what I want to close on for a second, not just from an R360 point of view, but just talking about women's rugby generally. We're just coming off the back of the biggest ever women's rugby World Cup.
Mm.
And the constant conversation about women's rugby is about the growth of it. Now, I think the context of that is that it's starting from very low. So 100% increase on a low number is still potentially a low number, but the growth is there and it is coming through. So my question to you about women's rugby is, and this kind of relates back to what we said right at the start about the separation between professional and amateur, is should women's rugby be governed in the same way that men's rugby has been, and or just be an offshoot of men's rugby? Or should we be talking about and governing women's rugby as its own thing in its own unique way, free from the shackles of men's rugby heritage, for want of a better word?
That's a question that I don't have an answer to because I can see both, I can see all the sides of it. I think, oh no, maybe I do have an answer actually, that I think to properly manage the growth, it probably needs to be governed separately. It certainly shouldn't be an offshoot of anything. I think it's too important. I mean, I was at the final in in September at Twickenham, and it was absolutely amazing. And it took me back to the amateur days of rugby when we were little and we'd go to Murrayfield, and it was, it was all families. It was, I mean, it helped that it was a the weather was lovely, but it
Mhm.
was all families. There were loads of kids there. There was a chap sitting behind us who was explaining to the child sitting next to him all about the rules. And I assumed that they'd known each other before. No. And it was absolutely brilliant. And it was such a great atmosphere. And I think to capitalize on that, women's rugby does need to be governed separately, but in parallel with the men's game, because they can leverage off each other, and you could get sponsorship deals and things like that. But I think in order to properly capitalize, it needs to be looked at independently.
I would probably tend to agree. I would probably tend to agree. And I noticed that you wanted to say something about R360's plans for the women's game as well.
Yeah, that was just insulting. I mean, that wasn't even back of a fag packet stuff. That was just, I think they'd come up with the plan and somebody gone, oh shit, we'd better include the women. And they'd come up and it was like, that's just rude.
That's the vibe I get for the Welsh, the WRU's plans as well. Because some people have said, "Oh, but if this does happen for the women, that would be great." And the vibe that I get is very much they've gone. Someone at the last minute has gone, and we're doing all this for the women as well, are we? And they've gone, "Oh yeah, yeah." Oh, I forgot about that. But yes,
So I have to think, it's Brian Moore's wife,
Belinda. Yes,
Belinda. She's involved in women's rugby in Wales.
yes. I can never remember her actual job title. In my
Yeah,
shout out Women's Rugby Treehouse, they just call her girl boss, because
and
it's not clear exactly what
no,
she
but
does.
I mean, she is a hugely experienced and knowledgeable sports administrator. And I would imagine that she can definitely hold her own. So I mean, maybe that's how they fill the principality. You get Belinda Moore to take on the WRU over the women's game. Because you could definitely sell tickets for that. But I think, yeah, I mean, I think again, this is where Portis fell down, because women's rugby and the potential growth should have been central to the plan, because it has to be. That's how you get people engaged. It's how you fill the principality. It's how you get people taking their kids to watch rugby and to play rugby at the weekends. It's absolutely essential now. And to be quite honest, I mean, I read a lot of people saying that they had enjoyed watching the Women's World Cup far more than they thought they would. It's running rugby. The skills that are
Mm.
on show are fantastic. And it's exciting, and you get upsets, and it's not all, and absolutely nothing against scrums, but it's not all scrums and kicking the ball, and it's different and it's great. And to not have that central to the plans going forward, I think is a mistake. I think it's a very, very big oversight. And whether that was deliberate or they were just overwhelmed, I don't know, but it's not good.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. But Nix, we've unfortunately reached the end of the time speaking together. So thank you so much for agreeing to come on. This has been a fascinating conversation. I genuinely believe that anybody who listens or watches to this will learn a huge amount, just as I have. Where can people find you if they want to get more from you?
So I'm on Blue Sky and I'm still on X, at Nicks NICKS JJ. And that's got the links to my business website. If people do want to reach out, if they want to have a conversation, please do. I'm always happy to talk rugby and talk governance. And certainly, if any of the clubs in Wales would like any advice about the EGM, please, yeah, get in touch. Delighted to have a chat. Delighted to listen and hopefully add some value.
Links in description down below, as I promised earlier. So that just leaves me to say thank you so much for everybody for listening. Remember to subscribe, follow, comment, do all of the things. Hit join if you've really, really enjoyed it. And enjoy the rugby. And I hope that everybody's team wins. Goodbye.